reliable sources. It was told as stories till it was actually all put down in writing about 750 years before Christ. The Iliad runs into 24 volumes, so I don't really know, Madeline, if anyone actually reads it today, but it's wonderful to have a novel like hers that actually focuses for us some of the themes, some of the ideas, some of the stories, and some of the characters from this ancient foundational epic. The Iliad, even though it is spread over so many volumes and is such a detailed text, Madeline was just telling me actually the action focuses only on a few weeks. 24 volumes of poetry focusing on a war that is being fought between the Greeks and the Trojans, but the poetry focuses on a few weeks in the 10th year of the war. Now what Madeline has done in her novel, and her novel was published last year, and she won the Orange Prize for it. And as you know, the Orange Prize is a British prize given to the best work of fiction published in that year by a woman writer. So Madeline's won the Orange Prize for the novel, and what she does with it, what she does with this enormous Greek epic, is that she focuses not so much the action as the point of view. Now the point of view is channeled through a character called Patroclus. Patroclus is both the closest companion and the lover of Achilles. And as you know, Achilles is the central hero of the Iliad. And he's this beautiful, handsome, very brave, skilled warrior who's half god and half man. He's born of a goddess and a mortal. But Madeline modernizes the Iliad in two ways. One, she talks about the whole action of the story from the point of view of this one character, Patroclus. We see his childhood, his love for Achilles, they're going to the war together, their experiences of the war over a decade, all of this through the eyes of this one character, Patroclus. The other way in which she modernizes the epic is by choosing to tell it from the point of view of Patroclus, who's a fairly minor character in the epic. And this, again, as we know, is a very modern tendency in fiction, that fiction is not the story of heroes. It used to be the story of heroes in the epics, but as our storytelling has modernized, our characters have become more and more ordinary, more and more everyday, more and more marginal. So these are the two ways in which I think she brings an epic into the novel form. And I'm going to start by asking Madeline to talk a little bit about this huge journey from this enormous epic to a 200 and something page novel, or is it 300 pages? But it is a standard length novel which has a lot of the elements of the Iliad, but can still be read as a novel where you're in the mind of these characters.
Thank you. The first thing I want to say is, lest anyone, I'm a classics teacher, so lest anyone be, afraid of, scared off from reading the Iliad. It's true, it's in 24 books, but the books are really more like chapters, so don't be intimidated. But what I was going to say is that as I was looking at the Iliad, one of the things that I sort of identified in the Iliad is that, as you say, it takes place over this very compressed period of time, the Trojan War, where the kind of united Greek city-states all go to attack the city of Troy, lasts for 10 years. But the Iliad really picks up in the final year, and it starts off with a real bang. It starts off with this unbelievable fight between Achilles, the best warrior of the Greeks, the most beautiful, the youngest of the Greeks, and Agamemnon, who has set himself up as sort of the leader of the Greek forces. Now, Agamemnon has a little bit of a claim to be the leader of the Greek forces. It's his brother, Menelaus, who's lost his wife, Helen. So he sort of says, well, it's my brother. And he also has the largest army chunk. But this fight breaks out because basically it's sort of a you're not the boss of me fight. Achilles says, Agamemnon, you can't tell me what to do. And Agamemnon says, oh, yes, I can. And it sort of goes downhill from there. And Achilles refuses to fight anymore. And so that's the beginning of the Iliad, and then the end of the Iliad is actually doesn't even get to the Trojan horse. It doesn't get to some of the iconic images we've seen in art and literature about sort of the fall of Troy and the sacking of Troy. The Iliad ends with the funeral of Hector, who is the great Trojan prince. And what's interesting about Hector is that even though supposedly this is Achilles' poem, it begins, "Sing, goddess of the terrible rage of Achilles." I think in many ways Hector, the Trojan prince, is the most admirable character, even though he's theoretically sort of the enemy, and that this poem was written by someone who identified as Greek. So that's also very interesting. But so that's the beginning and the end. But in the middle, there's kind of a mystery. And it was really the mystery that drew me to wanting to turn it into a novel. And the mystery is this, that you sort of see Achilles as he is sulking in his tent and refusing to fight. The Greeks start losing, and the Trojans start winning. And it gets worse and worse and worse. The Greek commanders are being killed. The Trojans actually tear open, one of the Trojan warriors tears open with his bare hands this wooden wall that the Greeks have built around their camp, break into the camp, and they start burning the Greek ships. And this spells utter disaster for the Greeks, because if their ships are gone, then they can't ever get home. They go from being an invading army to being refugees. And so this, the situation is at its absolute worst. The Greeks send a contingent to go to Achilles to sort of plead with him and say, will you fight? And Achilles says, no, absolutely not. I have said I wouldn't, and I'm not going to until Hector takes something from me. But the Greeks are still dying. So into this moment steps this character who's been a very minor character. He's been mentioned with Achilles almost every time Achilles is mentioned, but only kind of in the background. And this is Patroclus. He's named as the closest companion, the most beloved companion of Achilles. And at this moment, Patroclus says, well, let me try and convince him. I'm his closest companion. And he goes to Achilles weeping, falls on his knees and says, please, will you go fight? And Achilles says, no. And then so Patroclus says, well, how about this? Give me your armor, and I'll go out, and I'll pretend to be you, and I'll frighten the Trojans away, and everything will be fine. You'll keep your promise, we'll save the Greeks, it'll all be good. So Achilles agrees. Patroclus puts on Achilles' armor, heads out into the field, and does indeed, as soon as the Trojans see him, they think, oh my goodness, Achilles is fighting again, and they start running. And so it works, the plan is working, until, and I'm going to apologize if this is a spoiler, it's always hard to know if it's 3,000 years old, does it count as a spoiler? So I'm sorry, Patroclus is killed. And his death is completely devastating to Achilles. And we expect that Achilles will be sad, because we've heard he's his closest companion. But the effect upon Achilles is totally overwhelming. It's as if he's obliterated by grief and by rage. So completely forgetting his promise, Achilles immediately wants to go out and kill as many Trojans as possible because they have killed his beloved Patroclus. And so for me, the mystery was, who is Patroclus? Why does he matter so much to Achilles? He's his closest companion, okay, but Achilles' reaction is unlike anything else in the rest of the Iliad, and this is a poem that is full of death. It is full of people losing people that they love. And yet Achilles stands apart as so devastated. And so that was really what I wanted to answer. I sort of thought Homer tells us the end of their story. He shows us how deeply Achilles cares about this character, but he doesn't really tell us about that character or why. So I sort of thought, well, here's a little bit of space for me to kind of tell the beginning. So basically I set that moment, that mystery of Achilles' intense grief for Patroclus' death, kind of on my horizon, and I wrote towards it.
I think it's interesting, Madeline, how you are looking at the Iliad and you're looking at it as a story of these events and these actions on the part of these heroes, and what you're asking yourself is, what is the psychology behind these actions and these reactions? So again, to go back to my previous point, it's very much about the psychology of these characters. What prompted Achilles to act in the way he did when Patroclus died? What prompted Patroclus to be so loyal to Achilles? So again, it's interesting that you focus so much on the psychology, but I also wanted to move a little bit to the storytelling. And like I said earlier, the sources of the Iliad are oral, like the sources of all our epics. They are stories that are told, and at some point they coalesce and become written versions. But especially in India, the epics remain alive in multiple forms anyway, so there is no official version of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. And a folklorist would say there are as many Ramayans as there are tellers of the Ramayana. Do you see yourself when you're writing this novel, when you were writing this novel, as not just a retelling, but as an extension of this tradition of rewriting the epic, adding, you were telling me earlier when we were chatting that you actually made things up that don't exist in the sources, and I thought that was wonderful because that is your privilege as a novelist. So do you see yourself actually extending the tradition of taking an existing story and playing around with it and making it contemporary, rather than just doing the scholarly thing, which is giving us a commentary or giving us an insight into this epic? You're actually creating something new in writing this novel.
I think what I was trying to do as I was approaching this is I was trying to take all the kind of clues that the Iliad gives you. And you mentioned psychology, and I just want to address that for 1 second. Homer is often kind of insulted, the Iliad and the Odyssey are sometimes insulted as sort of saying, well, these characters are not very psychologically complex. They act, they're larger than life, they're, proud and angry, but they don't really have complex psychology. And I would actually disagree with that. I think that Homer doesn't give us the sort of Shakespearean soliloquy necessarily of these characters, but that the foundation for that psychology is there. And I think you can really see this in how incredibly adept Homer is, and other ancient poets as well, at conveying sort of the human condition. One of the things that always jumps out at me is, how much they understood what it meant to be a soldier who has to go to war and then come home, and what happens to soldiers who've been to war. The end of the Odyssey, for example, is an incredibly brilliant description of what happens when you've had your life threatened every day for 20 years, and then you have to try and walk into your house with your wife and your son, and face a threat there. How do you react? Odysseus slaughters every single one of the suitors. And then when their families come to complain, he's about to slaughter them as well. So what's amazing there is the psychology of, as people have kind of looked at, we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder today, but the ancients understood all of this, and they understood it really brilliantly. So I guess I would say that, I thought I was showing behind the scenes of the psychology, but I didn't feel like I was inventing it. I felt like I was really drawing on kind of this rich foundation that Homer gives you, just not filled in. So what I was trying to do as I was thinking about the storytelling is that I really wanted to tell an epic story, but I wanted to do it in a different way than in that epic voice that we all know, so well. The epic diction, and every kind of epic tradition has their own diction that they use, but in the particular Greek tradition, you use things like Homeric epithets, where you say things like swift-footed Achilles or rosy-fingered Dawn, the wine-dark sea, those sorts of things. And so all those kind of features of epic, I actually didn't want to use. I wanted to use, as you said, kind of a first-person narrator, which is pretty unusual. There really isn't kind of a first-person narrator epic ancient poem. So what I was really drawing on for that is I was drawing on the ancient lyric tradition. That the two kind of major ancient traditions in Greece and Rome was the epic tradition with gods and heroes and this larger-than-life language, and then the lyric tradition, which is the personal. It's the poetry of love and friendship and sort of daily life. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to take this mode, this lyric mode, and say, can I tell an epic story in a lyric mode?
Madeline, we should talk a little bit about the women in your story because this epic is so rich with men and male concerns, but the Trojan War is really fought over a woman, as we all know. So we should come back to that, but I'd like you to read a little bit just so that the audience gets a flavor of how you've transposed the epic mode into the lyric, just to get a sense of the prose.
So the section I'm going to be reading is from towards the beginning of the book. It's the beginning of Achilles and Patroclus' friendship. The two boys are around 11 years old when this takes place. And they meet because both boys are born princes. But Patroclus, when he's young, accidentally kills another boy. And he's exiled, sent in disgrace from his kingdom, and taken in by Achilles and Achilles' father as a charity case. So the two boys have just become friends. As I said, they're around 11 years old. Our friendship came all at once after that, like spring floods from the mountains. Before, the boys and I had imagined that his days were filled with princely instruction, statecraft and spear. But I had long since learned the truth. Other than his lyre lessons and his drills, he had no instruction. One day we might go swimming, another we might climb trees. We made up games for ourselves, of racing and tumbling. We would lie on the warm sand and say, "Guess what I'm thinking about?" The falcon we had seen from our window, the boy with the crooked front tooth, dinner. And as we swam or played or talked, a feeling would come. It was almost like fear in the way it filled me, rising in my chest. It was almost like tears in how swiftly it came. But it was neither of those, buoyant where they were heavy, and bright where they were dull. I had known contentment before, brief snatches of time in which I pursued solitary pleasure, skipping stones or dicing or dreaming. But in truth it had been less a presence than an absence, a laying aside of dread. My father was not near, nor boys. I was not hungry, nor tired, nor sick. This feeling was different. I found myself grinning until my cheeks hurt, my scalp prickling till I thought it might lift off my head. My tongue ran away from me, giddy with freedom. This and this and this, I said to him. I did not have to fear that I spoke too much. I did not have to worry that I was too slender or too slow. This and this and this. I taught him how to skip stones, and he taught me how to carve wood. I could feel every nerve in my body, every brush of air against my skin. He played my mother's lyre, and I watched. When it was my turn to play, my fingers tangled in the strings, and the teacher despaired of me. I did not care. Play again, I told him, and he played until I could barely see his fingers in the dark. I saw then how I had changed. I did not mind anymore that I lost when we raced, and I lost when we swam out to the rocks, and I lost when we tossed spears or skipped stones. For who can be ashamed to lose to such beauty? It was enough to watch him win, to see the soles of his feet flashing as they kicked up sand, or the rise and fall of his shoulders as they pulled through the salt. It was enough.
That reminds us that Madeline's novel is, at one level, just a very arresting story of this blossoming of friendship between two boys, which then becomes love. I'm going to come back now to the important question, which is the woman question. Reading your novel, I was reminded that the two central Indian epics are also about women, in the sense of conflict over women. The Mahabharata is fought because Draupadi is insulted, and in the Ramayana the war is fought because Sita is kidnapped, and in the Iliad the war is fought because Helen of Sparta is kidnapped by Paris of Troy. But the interesting thing here is that there's an ambiguity, or at least in your novel there's an ambiguity, because we don't know if Helen went of her own accord or she was actually forced to go with Paris. And there's speculation in your novel about whether Helen was just bored of her marriage with Menelaus, and did she just run away with Paris because she fell in love with him? Or was she actually, did they invade Sparta and carry her away? And I thought that was an interesting ambiguity because it suggests that Helen could be her own woman and she may have made this independent choice. But what is also interesting is that you never actually take us near Helen. We see her only once through the whole novel at the beginning before she's married to Menelaus as a veiled figure sitting in the court of her father. And after that, we only hear about her as, in the beginning, the immediate cause of the war, and eventually, when the war has dragged on for so long, she becomes more and more a remote cause because these men are just fighting because it seems like that's what they're there to do. And Helen becomes more and more shadowy. And I was interested in why this was so. What would have been like, for instance, to write the whole novel from the point of view of Helen?
People have done it, and actually Helen is one of the most consistently, I think, kind of written about and explored characters, and the ambiguity that you mentioned is absolutely in both ancient material and modern material. It's sort of no one can quite get to her motive. Everyone is kind of speculating about what her motive is. You know, did she run away? Was she kidnapped? In some versions of the story, it's not even her. It's a golden phantom that is taken to Troy, and she hangs out in Egypt for 10 years. So it really is, I feel like that story kind of captures the sense of people sort of throwing up their hands. Someone actually, you mentioned Sita, someone in the, I was part of the panel of the Epic Imagination event, and someone asked, you know, can you compare Sita and Helen? And I think it's very interesting to see how they both function, you say, as the cause of war. But what I was interested in particular about Helen is the fact that most of the men who are fighting for her have never seen her, and they have no idea who she is. And that actually, although she is sort of the cause of the war, in kind of the big, you know, bold headline of the war, that actually Agamemnon, the sort of, as I said, this powerful Greek king, has been gunning for Troy for a long time, because Troy is an incredibly rich city. And so I think sometimes we fight wars for, you know, we say it's for one reason, but really it's for another reason. And, you know, the reason means one thing to the commanders and another thing to the majority of soldiers who are getting dragged there. So part of what I was interested in is the experience of all these other soldiers who haven't ever seen her, who have no stake in this, but who are kind of pulled along into this war.
Okay, so
well, I was going to say something about other women.
The other women. Do you want to talk about the other women in the story?
Sure.
Okay.
As you say, the Iliad is definitely male-centric, but there are some very strong female characters. One of them is Andromache, Hector's wife, who is just as strong a character as he is, but of course I'm telling the story from Patroclus' perspective, so I don't really get to see Andromache very much. But one of the characters that was really a foundation of the novel for me is the character of Briseis. And Briseis has been captured taken as a slave and given as a war prize to Achilles. And she actually becomes kind of the point of contention between Achilles and Agamemnon in that big blowout fight that starts the Iliad. Agamemnon basically confiscates her, and he says, if you're not going to listen to me, then you don't deserve your war prize anymore, and he takes her. And that sort of is the big cause of the conflict, because that's a huge dishonor to Achilles, that she was given to Achilles as a prize, and to remove her is, you know, death to his reputation, basically. But she has a very interesting part in the Iliad to play, other than just as this object of kind of tug of war and as a symbol, which is that she delivers the most beautiful eulogy over Patroclus' dead body once he's been killed. And in this speech that she delivers, she says something really extraordinary about the character of Patroclus. She says, "You were always gentle." And that really jumped out at me, because if you have read any of the Greek mythology, you know that heroes are not gentle. They're not described that way. And what's amazing is that he's actually called gentle another time as well, by someone completely different, by Menelaus, actually, the king of Sparta. And but it was her speech and her relationship with Patroclus that really formed one of the pillars of the work. Because I thought how extraordinary that this friendship has kind of grown up between her and between Patroclus, and her vision of Patroclus, her ability to see into Patroclus's character and the truth of his character, I felt was extraordinary. So I really wanted to give her, she's not my narrator, but I really wanted to give her her full place and her full voice in the story.
Yeah, this character that Madeline's talking about is, sorry, how do you pronounce it again?
Briseis.
Perseus?
Mhm.
Perseus, yeah. Perseus is an interesting character in her own right, but she's also interesting because she's a foreigner. She's a Trojan, and she is captured as a slave, and there's a story of a friendship between her and Patroclus. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this notion of the Trojan as a foreigner. So you have this scenario where there are all these Greek islands. They each have their own king, and there are skirmishes and battles between them. It's very much the sense that they're all their own kingdoms. But when the Trojan War happens, they all sort of unite in this Greek cause, and they go to fight this Eastern enemy. And like Madeline just said, maybe the real cause of the war was that this Eastern enemy is very rich and has a reputation for being ripe for conquest. And I was interested in the fact that already in the Iliad, which, like I said, is written 750 years before Christ, you already have this idea of a Western power or Western powers coming to attack a decadent, wealthy Eastern outpost. And as we know, that narrative plays out so many times over history. You have it in the time of the Crusades, you have it in the whole narrative of colonialism. So was there already an idea then that, and Troy, as Madeline was telling me, is in present-day Turkey. It's near Istanbul. So was it very strong historically, this idea that there is this Eastern kingdom that is very foreign to the Greeks and that should be or can be conquered?
So the question of East and West in the Iliad is very complicated. And it's complicated for a number of reasons. First and foremost, that the Greeks identified Homer as a Greek who lived in basically along the Turkish coast in Smyrna. So I talked before about how Hector, the Trojan prince, is kind of the most admirable character in the work, and then here you have Homer, who's the poet, who isn't from kind of traditional mainland Greece, but he's actually from Turkey, even though he identifies as Greek. So there's that. There's also the fact that Homer uses the expedient of having all the Greeks and Trojans speak the same language, i.e. Greek, and that the Trojans actually don't worship their own gods. They worship Greek gods. So it's kind of, he basically extends the Greek culture to be a universalizing among for the Trojans as well. So I think that there's that kind of complexity. And then there's a further complexity to kind of separate the Greeks and Trojans into East and West by the fact that the Trojan aristocrat Aeneas, after the fall of Troy, leaves Troy, sets sail with a bunch of Trojan refugees, goes to Italy, and founds basically the Roman people. And so now you really have, an interesting mythological confusion here of what it means, because now the Romans are Trojans. And so that's really interesting. And when they attack and conquer Greece, they say, this is for the Trojans. We're finally getting our vengeance. So it's a very interesting thing. And I think that there was a session earlier this week where Tom Holland was talking a little bit about kind of the Persian Wars as being one of the first kind of clashes where you can look at sort of a self-identified East and West. And I think that but in the mythology, I think it's much more complex than that. There's all this intermingling.
It's interesting also because in the time of the Iliad, we're in a mythological time. There are human beings and there are human concerns, but there are also gods and there are godly concerns. and they are, like Achilles, half gods and half humans. There are lesser gods and higher gods. So it's a universe in which there are all these hierarchies. And the way they play out, I think, is one of the elements of the story. And it's interesting to think that about 400 years later, you would have Alexander the Great appearing on the scene and then actually going out to conquer the East. So it's quite near to that historical moment when there is actually a journey towards the East and this idea of an empire. But I want to come back to the idea of the gods for a moment and leave the historical for now. The idea of the gods in fiction is interesting to me because in India right now we're writing more and more supernatural fiction, fantasy, fiction, thrillers deriving from the epics. And here in your novel, what you do is that you have a very naturalistic style. And the aesthetic is very naturalistic. The way you describe the development of a human being, that's very, very naturalistic. But you also have the supernatural. You have the god Apollo suddenly sending down a plague when he's angry. Or when Patroclus is trying to scale the walls of Troy. Apollo is a huge hulking figure, just sort of reaches out and plucks him and throws him off the walls. Now these are sort of, these are not naturalistic moments, they're the supernaturalistic moments, but you weave them in very, very seamlessly into the narrative. How did you do that? How did you resist the temptation? Or why did you choose to not make this a more supernatural kind of story? And keep it within the framework of the naturalistic, but with these moments of the supernatural.
Well, I think when you're kind of approaching this time period, you do come to this fork in the road where you sort of say, am I going to follow Homer? Am I going to have centaurs in my novel? Or am I going to kind of tell it straight? And I really felt that because Homer was my primary inspiration, that the gods are so central to Homer, and I felt like I really wanted them to be part of the novel as well. I felt like that given that I was drawing on Homer, they were totally inextricable for me from the story. So as I was kind of thinking about that, I was really drawing a lot on, I love magical realism, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, many Latin American authors. And so as I was sort of writing this, I was actually thinking about things like mythological realism. That's kind of the name of the genre I gave it, in my own head, is that I wanted that naturalistic, that realistic, the lyric voice grounded in personal experience, in, daily sensory life. But I also wanted to incorporate these elements. And so it was just kind of a matter of trying it out, experimenting. How does it work to bring the gods in? And there were a few moments actually where I took gods out. So I didn't follow every instance of the gods that appear in the Iliad, but I followed many of them. And of course, one of the central divine characters in this story and in the Iliad as well is Achilles' mother, who's a goddess, and she's a sea nymph. So in the kind of divine scale, I was really interested in her character because Greek mythology, the pantheon is incredibly hierarchical. So you have kind of Zeus all the way up here at the top, and the other, 11 Olympian gods, and then low nymphs on the totem pole. You have the sea nymphs, you have the water nymphs, the mountain nymphs, and that they, even though they're gods, they're actually don't have nearly as much power, and they can't really kind of come in and blast you in the same way that someone like Zeus can. And so I was interested also in the realism of that fantastical part of the story, because what I find so moving about Achilles' mother is the fact that here she is, she's a goddess, and she still can't save her son's life.
Would you like to read a little bit about Thetis, because I think she's a very striking character?
Sure. So the section I'm going to read is actually the first time that Patroclus meets the sea nymph, the goddess. Again, he's about 11 years old when this is happening, and she hates humans. She hates mortals, except for her own son, and she sort of is trying to make her son into a god. So she very much disapproves of his friendship with Patroclus, and That's all I'll say. The next night, when the household slept, I climbed out of our window. The moon was half full, bright enough for me to pick my way over the rocks without a torch. He had said that I was to stand in the surf, and she would come. No, he had reassured me. You do not need to speak. She will know. The waves were warm and thick with sand. I shifted, watched the small white crabs run through the surf. I was listening, thinking I might hear the splash of her feet as she approached. A breeze blew down the beach, and grateful, I closed my eyes to it. When I opened them again, she was standing before me. She was taller than I was, taller than any woman I had ever seen. Her black hair was loosed on her back, and her skin shone luminous and impossibly pale, as if it drank light from the moon. She was so close I could smell her, seawater laced with dark brown honey. I did not breathe. I did not dare. You are Patroclus. I flinched at the sound of her voice, hoarse and rasping. I'd expected chimes, not the grinding of rocks in the surf. Yes, lady. Distaste ran over her face. Her eyes were not like a human's. They were black to their center and flecked with gold. I could not bring myself to meet them. He will be a god, she said. I did not know what to say, so I said nothing. She leaned forward, and I half thought she might touch me, but of course she did not. Do you understand? I could feel her breath on my cheek, not warm at all, but chilled like the depths of the sea. Do you understand? He had told me, too, that she hated to be kept waiting. Yes. She leaned closer still, looming over me. Her mouth was a gash of red, like the torn-open stomach of a sacrifice, bloody and oracular. Behind it, her teeth shone sharp and white as bone. Good. Carelessly, as if to herself, she added, You will be dead soon enough. She turned and dived into the sea, leaving no ripples behind her.
Madeline took 10 years to write this novel, she was just telling me, and she is a classical literature scholar and she teaches classical literature. But I was wondering, Madeline, why you took so long? Is it because you're a scholar and there is a lot of material that you had to research? Is it because there is already a strong tradition of writing novels based on the Iliad? Is it simply because you're a perfectionist? What were you doing for those 10 years?
Good question. So when you take 10 years to write a novel, somewhere kind of around year 5, your friends and family stop asking you about it because they sort of get to the point where it's like, she's never going to finish it. Just don't talk to her about it. But I think that, so there were a number of moments in those 10 years where I sort of thought, am I really going to do this? I was teaching at the same time, and I was also directing plays, both things that I absolutely loved. And so there were kind of moments where I thought, you know, I have these two things that I love. Do I really need to tell this story? And what kept coming back to me is yes, that I couldn't let these characters go. And I think partially it took so long because I was doing these other projects at the same time. But partially it also took that long just because I was really learning how to write. This is my first novel, and there's a saying about writing that you have to write, you know, 1 million bad words before you can write any good ones. So I sort of feel like I was working through my bad words, hopefully getting to some good ones. About halfway through, I mentioned the lyric, kind of approaching it from a lyric place. That actually wasn't my understanding of the novel when I first started writing it. And so the other reason that it took so long to finish is that about halfway through, I threw out an entire draft and started over from scratch. And I threw out because I didn't feel like I had the lyric voice that I wanted. I had actually been too influenced by the epic. I was using too much of the epic language. And what I came to understand is that Patroclus himself would never speak with epic language because he doesn't really identify with the world of epic. There's a myth about the hero Achilles that when he's very young, when he's a teenager, he's given this terrible choice. And the choice is that he can live a long and happy life, or he can die young and be famous forever. And he chooses to die young and to be famous forever. So that's the epic choice. But Patroclus, I think, would not have made that same choice. And so he gets pulled into the world of epic because he loves Achilles, but it isn't where he lives most of the time. And so that's why I really needed to put that epic voice away and find a more personal voice. The interesting kind of coda to that story about Achilles choosing to die young and be famous forever is that in the Odyssey, Odysseus goes down to the underworld for a number of reasons, and he sees the spirit of Achilles down there, and Patroclus as well. And he says to Achilles, Achilles, here you are, you know, you're king of the dead, you're the most famous, it must feel really great, you got what you wanted. And Achilles says, no, I made the wrong choice. It's better to be alive and to be nothing than to be dead and, you know, be the most famous warrior.
And do you think this journey that Achilles makes, this realization at the end, is that one of the reasons why we go back to the Iliad? To sort of constantly return to the story of the flawed hero. If not, why do we return to this epic? What are the ways in which the Iliad sort of has traveled into the present? What is the relevance of that story today for readers everywhere?
I think that, I mean, I can really only speak personally, but for me it is Achilles' flaws. That I mentioned the first line of the Iliad, sing goddess of the destructive rage of Achilles. From the very first line, we know that this hero is not a perfect person. He's raining down destruction and misery upon everyone around him, upon his own people, upon the enemy. And yet at the same time, he's very admirable in many ways. One of the things that I was drawn to about Achilles, I've sort of mentioned this a little bit before, is how incredibly young he is. And I teach teenagers, and so that's basically how old Achilles is when he goes to war. And think about how young that really is. And so he goes off to war knowing that he has this death sentence. He's chosen it, but he still has to live with it. And that's very moving. He's basically sacrificed everything in his life, all his happiness, for this chance at immortality, at fame. And I think that's a very moving story, the choices we make about our life, about what things we pursue in our life and what we then have to live with. And also the fact that he basically gets backed into a corner, and he sort of says this thing, I'm not going to fight, and because he refuses to fight, Patroclus goes out, and then he loses Patroclus, and he loses the thing in his life that's most important to him. And so how we can sort of get trapped into making choices based on our own pride that then lead us in, directions that are ultimately catastrophic to our lives.
As we know, Homer wrote the Iliad, and then which is the story of the war, and then he wrote the Odyssey, which is the story of the hero returning from the war. And Madeline, you were telling me you were actually looking forward now to start working on a new novel, which is going to be based on the Odyssey. Would you like to say a little bit about that? Are you excited? Are you dreading staying with Odysseus for another 10 years? Why do you want to write this second book?
Odysseus was initially, I think, maybe the character that I was most intimidated to write. He's supposed to be the smartest of all the Greeks. He's incredibly complex. And he has this long history of people writing, kind of from his perspective, writing about him. But what I came to feel is that he is so fascinating and he's so fun to explore his perspective. And partially it's because he makes such a wonderful opposite to Achilles. That you have Achilles, I kind of talked about him as a young man, the bold man, brash, idealistic, passionate, honest to a fault. And then you have Odysseus, who's the older man, the experienced diplomat, the liar, the storyteller. And so I'm sort of interested in the split between those two, and in following Odysseus' adventures as he finally gets home to Ithaca, and how he can sort of re-embrace his life there if he can. I'm also interested in the Odyssey because there are some truly dynamite female characters in the Odyssey. Odysseus' wife is every bit as smart as he is, maybe even smarter. And then you have, wonderful kind of goddesses who come in and out of the story. The great goddess of wisdom, Athena, the witch, Circe, who turns men into pigs, Calypso, the beautiful nymph who helps Odysseus but also kind of keeps him prisoner. So there are many, many really strong characters that I'm looking forward to exploring.
I'm looking forward to reading that novel for sure, because I really, really enjoyed The Song of Achilles, and I would recommend it to anyone who's interested in the Greek epics. Madeline, I would love to keep grilling you, but we've run out of time. So if there are any questions, we can pass the mic around.
Hi, I'm Arjun. I work with high school students just like you, Madeline, and this question is more about the craft of writing and how you see the world around you with teenagers. Did the environment of teaching in a high school influence the way you built the kinship between the characters, Patroclus and Achilles? In general, understanding of human nature, early teen, and how it influenced your writing.
The short answer is yes. The long answer is that I think it's always hard, at least it is for me as a writer, to kind of unpack what are the specific things that influence and go into the book. I think it's a type of question that maybe my close friends and family could answer for you. They're like, oh yeah, that's totally about her, the time she did this. But certainly I think I was very influenced in, I wanted such an emphasis on their formative years as children and as teenagers, because I can see how powerful those years can be as a teacher to students. So I certainly think that influenced. And one of the things that was interesting in their relationship is not just how close Achilles and Patroclus become, but the fact that they become very close as children, and that the people that you grow up with and that kind of know you from, and they've seen you from when you're very young, that there's really a special bond there. So I was also looking at that.
Sorry. I was curious just how so we talk about like the myth and we talk about the history of these myths. And so we have these ideas that like, okay, Achilles is killed by an arrow and then Troy falls because there's a horse, etc., etc. And the same thing happens with all myths, so that we turn them into histories. And I was curious how you came to that own understanding of like, I'm going to insert the gods, I'm not going to insert the gods, like in the process of telling the history of the myth, you're creating the myth again, and what that process actually is when you have to like come into contact with the historical fabric that is the myth, and how people are going to respond to that mythic, your new creation of the same thing.
Thank you. Well, I was very clear from the beginning that for the most part I was going to be following Homer, who is mythology. So I wasn't trying to write, I sort of knew from the beginning that I didn't want to write, for example, a historical fiction set in the Mycenaean Bronze Age, and trying to draw from, trying to follow the historical record. And one of the although where Homer was silent, I did kind of pull from the historical record, so there was some mixing there. I mentioned that in the Iliad, Homer has the Greeks and Trojans all speak Greek, and they all worship the Greek gods. I wanted that to be a little more realistic, and so I brought in the fact that the Trojans might have known Greek because they were wonderful traders and they're controlling the very rich area of the Hellespont. So they would have had people coming through and they would have been like all good kind of trading civilizations. They basically speak every language that they come into contact with, but that they have their own language as well. And so I did bring in some historical things like that. But I think that there's just sort of, partially it's just instinctual. You know, that there's the day where, you know, you meet the centaur who's going to teach Achilles and Patroclus for the next 2 years. It's sort of like, well, now I'm okay, today's the day, let's describe that centaur. And you just sort of have to go for it. You have to have conviction that he belongs in your story and not let yourself be embarrassed about it and just go. And I think that for me, partially, it helped that I wasn't really, I actually kept it a secret that I was working on this, except for my very close friends and family. I didn't tell my professors, I didn't tell my friends who were in graduate school in classics, because I was a little worried that they would say, "You're doing what? You're putting a centaur in?" So I think it's also just having conviction in the story that you want to tell and following that line all the way through.
I have a question. Did you ever consider the possibility that Achilles might actually be the son of a god? Would it have made your treatment of him more sympathetic?
As I was writing this, that's an excellent question. I think that in order for me to write, and I certainly do not speak for other writers when I say this, but in order for me to write, I need to believe absolutely in what I'm writing. My husband can tell you that when he walks through and I'm writing, he often stops and says, "Are you okay?" Because I'm making the most horrible faces, because I'm responding like the characters in the scene. And so I feel like, and maybe this is my background in theater, that when I write, I live the scene. I really am I feel like I'm in it, I'm looking at it, I'm part of it, I'm sort of in my mind, placing myself as the different characters. So as I was writing the book, yes, absolutely, he was the son of a goddess.
There's a question here in the middle. Yeah.
My question is, a bit more as a classicist to you rather than for the Song of Achilles. There's a lot of books out in the genre urban fantasy right now, and a lot of them take information from different mythologies. Did you ever consider interposing or juxtaposing your knowledge of mythology and bringing your characters to the present tense, rather than writing in the past, rather than staying in the world of the Iliad?
I certainly really enjoy it when authors do that. There's a novel by the author Mark Merlis. It was released under 2 different names. It's called both An Arrow's Flight and Pyrrhus, where he basically takes the character of Achilles' son, who in my book is very villainous, but not in all the mythology. So Achilles' son, whose name is Pyrrhus, and places him in a modern context, you know, with his father being a half-god, with the gods being around, with all kinds of fantastical things, but set in the modern context. And it's the sort of thing that when you hear someone describe it, it almost sounds terrifying, like, can that possibly work? But he does it very boldly and very brilliantly. For me, I wasn't looking for that so much. It really kind of wasn't something that I considered. I would certainly consider it in the future, but I felt like this story, I really wanted it to have its ancient context.
Are there any more questions? There's one here in the front.
You have chosen to describe Achilles' death as an arrow through his heart, rather than his heel, as we popularly know. May I know why?
Did everyone? Yeah. What she says is that you've chosen to describe Achilles' death as caused by an arrow through his heart rather than through his heel, which is the traditional story. Why did you choose to do that?
So the story of Achilles' heel, we kind of talked about how myths get retold and retold and retold and added to. The story of Achilles' heel is actually a very late addition to the stories about Achilles. And it's not, even though it's the most famous one, it's kind of come down to us as the story about Achilles. the fact that in the Iliad it's not mentioned at all, nor in the Odyssey. So Achilles is just kind of an extraordinary warrior, but he doesn't have, there's nothing, he's a normal person other than the fact that he's so extraordinary as a fighter. And partially what I was interested in is that if you had someone who's truly a gifted and extraordinary writer, those are exactly the sort of stories that would start to pop up, as people would say, well, I tried to kill him, but I didn't kill him because he's invulnerable. That's why. It wasn't my fault. And so I was kind of interested. There's a hint where a character references that as a story that's told about Achilles in the story. But I didn't want to take it as kind of the truth because it wasn't in Homer, and Homer was my primary source. And I was kind of playing with this idea that it's the sort of thing that would have developed as legends about Achilles spread.
Are there more questions? Well,
It's right
just
there.
behind you.
I was just curious to hear how you found your lyrical voice after throwing out the first draft.
So, the Greeks talk about the muses, and it did kind of feel that way, actually. That I went to a writer's workshop. I really had no formal training in writing. I was so excited in college to take every classics course that I possibly could that I didn't take any writing courses. So maybe if I had, it wouldn't have taken me 10 years. The course I took wasn't even about fiction. It was actually a nonfiction course because I also write personal essays and that sort of thing. So I was going for that. But it was an incredibly fertile environment. There were lots of writers who were coming and talking about their work. There were lots of other kind of people who were in the same stage I was. They were working on something. They weren't sure where to go. And just being surrounded by that, I thought, you know what? Let me take another crack at this. I feel like I know it's wrong. Let me think about how to make it right. And I kind of sat down in front of my computer. It was a little bit, it did kind of feel like the muses were with me. And I thought, what about if I try it like this? And I started typing, and I kind of got the first page down that became the first page. And that once I had that first page, that kind of tone in my head, then I got it. I could go.
Do we have time for more questions? One last question. Is there a question? There's one here.
Hi. It's just my basic observation that when it comes to literature, most of the claimed literature essentially turn out to be tragedies. And hardly any literature that is humorous is acclaimed. So just trying to understand that if you would have an idea, why does that happen?
So the question is about kind of tragedy and
No, why humor? Why comedies are not acclaimed as great literature?
That's a really good question. So I'm going to give you my really and totally honest opinion, which is that I think that the Greek comedies are not really that funny. Don't tell other classicists I said that. But partially the reason that they're not funny is because they rely particularly on so much topical, popular humor of the day. So it's like, man, that guy's as fat as, and it lists an obscure Athenian politician that we've never heard of. And so that joke doesn't make any sense to us. It's not funny because we don't know who that person is. And so if you're reading a Greek comedy, one that has good footnotes, it says, that guy's as fat as so-and-so. And then the footnote is, this must have been a fat man in Athens. So it doesn't really give you a lot of sort of insight into the comedy. There are some really wonderful moments, and of course, that tradition of Greco-Roman comedy eventually became incredible art forms in Commedia dell'arte, in Shakespeare. So I'm very grateful for them. But if I'm looking to laugh, I don't go to the ancient comedy.
I think we will have to end on that note. Long live the tragedies. Thank you so much for listening, and thanks, Madeline.
Thank you.